Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming today, and thank you, Joy, for putting this together for us all today. I am very excited to give this talk. I'm also very nervous to give this talk. I'd much rather talk to strangers than my colleagues, so because you all will know when I mess up. But this is a project that's been near and dear to my heart for several years now, and it's coming to fruition. It's a look at the cumulative disadvantage process in the criminal justice system, and we call it looking at it from a new lens. My co-author Teddy Wilson and I, because it's an understudied topic, at least in my opinion, and one that everyone talks about and everyone knows happens, but no one really fully understands the process. So my clicker does not seem to be working. But I just use the mouse. Let's see. Yeah, I think we have a dead battery in the clicker. Okay, I'll just use the mouse. Okay, so the origin of the project, when I was at the University of Albany, I worked very closely with the New York Division of Criminal Justice Services on several projects, including starting the Youth Justice Institute there. So I had access to a lot of their data that other people might not have access to. So I got this big idea in 2018. It kind of came out of my colleague, Brian Johnson, who's a Penn State alum at Maryland. He and I had done a piece, or were working on a piece for the annual review of criminology on cumulative disadvantage. And looking at the research, most studies, which I'll talk about a little bit more, look at this point, that point, this point. And it's hard to kind of take a look at the whole process, as we were finding writing that piece. So when I talked to the Division of Criminal Justice Services, I was able to get this data that was from arrest, arraignment, dismissals, alternative dispositions, plea bargains, trials, the whole way through sentencing. So you have the complete picture for 9 million arrests. So I get this data file with 9 million arrests, not 9 million people, it was about 4 million people, 9 million arrests. And I was going to write an article with it, and I really quickly realized I was in way over my head, and that this wasn't just an article. There was no way to do this in 1 or 2 articles. And luckily, we had recently hired Theodore Wilson. He came out of the University of Maryland, and he's one of my best friends and colleagues that I still work with at Albany. And he was excited to come on the project with me and help turn it into a book, so we would have one cohesive piece that actually takes you through that process. So we started that in 2019, and we're hopefully finishing it in January. It's set to be published by Temple University Press next year. We're getting there, but it's been a journey, because there's so much data to look at and so many different ways you can look at it, interpret it. So it's really been a long-term thought process, and not just going in and running a regression or running a data model. So it's been interesting. Why is this important? Why did we want to look at the whole process versus one stage? Well, we know from a lot of the literature, especially in sentencing literature, we talk about signaling, how something someone did earlier on down the line can signal another courtroom actor or a judge that a particular individual is particularly dangerous or not dangerous, and how that can play into the courtroom work group. And we also know that each stage can build upon the previous, but it can also sometimes correct for the previous stage. And this is where I have to take a moment and look at my notes to make sure I didn't forget. I always move ahead and don't look at what I wrote. So I want to make sure I didn't miss anything on this slide. Okay. So basically, what this says, you can inform and move forward, but you can also correct and move backwards. And this is often referred to as the hydraulic nature of the system. John Hagan talked about this as far back as 1974, and called for more research to look at this process and how it worked between the decision-making points, and not just at one decision-making point. However, not many people have data to do that. It's not that people don't want to do it. It's just that it's something that's very hard to get the data for and to accomplish. So therefore, a lot of the existing research that we do have in our field focuses on 1 or 2 specific decision-making points. For example, when I was an undergrad studying criminology, I was learning a lot about policing. There was a big uptick in the policing literature in the 1960s and 1970s. Then enter sentencing commissions, and sentencing data became more readily available. And in the 80s and 90s, a lot of research started coming out looking at the sentencing process and what happens at the end stage. And in the 1990s, when I was a grad student, following my career here, the research started to come out that looked more at the plea bargaining process and what's the power of the prosecutor, all this stuff that happens behind closed doors that happens before sentencing. But again, each piece was kind of looking at one stage and not really connecting the dots. Now, scholars started trying to do this, as I realized when I was working on that piece with Dr. Johnson for the annual review of criminology, started trying to figure out how do we look at more than one decision point, maybe two, maybe three. So the first person to work on this that we looked at was Sutton. And what Sutton did was he really addressed the issues by looking at a diverse sample of criminal defendants, calculating the posterior predicted probabilities of various case processing outcomes, and he conditioned each outcome on the prior stage. So that was, what is the signal being sent? Can we condition it on the prior stage to see what's going to happen? And then anyone can correct me on my pronunciation. Kudatalets? Could anyone have a better pronunciation? I always booger up his name. Jeff? Kudatalets. Oh, wow. Yeah. I did bugger that up. Okay. He examined specific combinations of patterns of arrests and outcomes across the different stages. For his research, he focused a lot on, let's see, minority defendants and were they at enhanced risk of specific combinations of unfavorable outcomes. So like pre-trial detention to sentencing. So he looked at these stages and he did find that Black and Latino defendants were much more likely than white defendants to be detained at that pre-style and to receive lesser pleas during their custodial stay. If they got a plea while they were in custody, it was a lesser plea. And then the last study that really informed our thinking for this book was the one by Woolbridge and his colleagues. And they had about 3,500 felony defendants nested in 123 prosecutors across about 34 judges. And they looked at bond, pretrial detention again, non-suspended prison sentences, and sentence length and size of a plea bargain. They found significant effects for a lot of the bond and the pretrial detention, not so much on the sentencing. But one thing that they did that kind of informed our approach was they looked at the size of a plea bargain, which you'll see I get to kind of at the end here, by classifying offenses. So when you look at what you were arrested for, what were you finally convicted for, and what's the difference? And how do you measure that difference? And does that differ between Blacks, whites, Hispanics? So if you're arrested on a B felony, do you get pled to a C felony, which is lower, a D felony, or do you get the whole way down to a misdemeanor? And who's getting the larger pleas and why? So that article is really influential for us in our thinking as we move forward with the book. Now my mouse is not moving me forward. Okay. So the traditional thinking that I was seeing from everything I was reading, writing the article, again with Dr. Johnson, was that everyone assumed it's automatically cumulative disadvantage the whole way through the system. Once you're in, it gets worse, it gets worse, it gets worse at every stage. And in that article, we talked about it as the reverse Matthew effect. But Teddy and I think about this a little differently. We assume that at each stage, it could possibly go either way. Maybe you're disadvantaged at one stage, but at the next stage, the courtroom actor or an attorney or someone says, well, that was an unfair charge, or that was an unfair pretrial detention. We're going to kind of throw in a correction factor, if you will. So we're leaving a two-way street here instead of a one-way street in every way we look at the disadvantage. Does that make sense? Okay. So our book is kind of modeled that we start out just by talking about all the different steps in the process, explaining it and explaining our sample so that as you go through the chapters, we don't have to always, like you do an article, explain your sample. It's already there up front, which was nice. We only had to do that once. And then we do a chapter on arrest, which is completed, a chapter on dismissals and alternative dispositions, like you have an ARD, alternative rehabilitation disposition here in Pennsylvania. They have a similar thing in New York. Plea bargains, sentencing, which we're finishing the sentencing chapter now. And then the next chapter is the real fun one, where we do the whole process together. And we work with different samples and we work backwards and we use the methods these other authors have used to show what they capture, what they don't capture. And then our conclusion chapter will be, where should the field go from here? Do we find anything that should be relevant for research? So that's kind of the flow of the book as it's moved along. Okay. So what we did, because we have some follow-up articles and pieces where we look at recidivism, we had so many cases, we decided we were going to start with 2010 to 2013 as our original arrest cohort. So that's the beginning sample for the book. Over a million people that were arrested in New York in those years. We picked 2010 as a start date because that's after the Rockefeller laws changed. If anyone's familiar with the harsh New York Rockefeller laws for drugs, that had changed, the change finished by 2009. So we picked that as a start point for a reason. We kept only the first arrest during that time period. So if you were arrested in 2010 in January and then arrested in 2010 in February, the February event's recidivism. We kept the first one. Most serious offense per arrest, and the others, as I said, were coded as recidivism for our follow-up work. So here's basically kind of what the sample we had to start with looked like. So we had over 1 million arrests, and we were able to divide it into white, black, and other by both non-Hispanic and Hispanic ethnicity. They did a lot of coding in New York to separate the ethnicities. And you can see most of our sample is white, either non-Hispanic or Hispanic. We also have a large portion of black offenders, about 38%, very small proportion of other offenders, white or black. So in some of our models, we're able to use them and model them. And in others, we only focus on the non-Hispanic white black and the Hispanic white black differences, depending on the category and how many we have to work with. So the other thing I wanted to talk about on this slide, am I supposed to stay in front of the camera? Can I? I can. These are the offenses categories as they're classified in New York. So an unclassified misdemeanor, these are a lot of DUIs, make up a lot of it, and there's some other weird just offenses in there that don't happen much. B misdemeanor, similar to Pennsylvania, it's your lowest level misdemeanor. It's punishable basically by up to 90 days. An A misdemeanor is up to 2 years. Then you move into your felonies, and E felonies 4 years. D felony, I believe, is 10. Then you go 15, 25, life. A felony, you've killed somebody. Your murders and homicide. So it's kind of similar to how our offense OGSs and categories work in Pennsylvania. So this is going to be important to remember as I go through the different tables, that this is how we're looking at who's getting dismissed, who's getting a plea bargain, how is it moving across categories. Any questions on the sample? Okay. So the first thing we realized, and obviously you all know too, but arrest does not equal conviction. A lot of arrests happen that do not lead to a conviction, and it does not necessarily even lead to an arraignment or any type of prosecution. It's not just that you don't get convicted at a trial, it's that it can be dismissed at several stages. Well, the first thing that happened for us was we said, wow, we have way more dismissals than we expected. Almost 44% of the arrests are getting dismissed in the state of New York. I don't know what it is in Pennsylvania, but that shocked me that it was that high. And you can see it's different by race and ethnicity. For non-Hispanic Blacks, it's over half of our sample that has their arrest dismissed. That's a lot of the sample that you lose when you start a conviction. You lose a lot of that action that happened from arrest to arraignment, these other alternative dispositions that don't show up. And it also varied by region. New York City, 58% of all arrests were dismissed. And the rest of the state, which we call Ross, it's our New York term for it, just Ross, and you got New York City and Ross, kind of like we have Philly, Pittsburgh, and Alabama, people call it. I know Jeff doesn't like that, but that's how people refer to Pennsylvania. So Ross is the whole rest of the state, which some of it's still pretty urban, like Rochester, Syracuse, but there's a lot of, kind of like Pennsylvania, there's a lot of very rural, areas. So this was interesting to us, and we do some breakdowns in the book. I'm not going to do too much of that today because there's a lot to get through. But we do some breakdowns by New York City and the rest of the state as we go through things based on this initial. Did that surprise anyone, or would you think that was I the only one surprised, or seemed like a lot of? So in most samples start with conviction, right? So you've missed like a lot. So that's kind of what I'm going to focus more on today. And we also then broke down the dismissals by race and the arrest class. Remember, so we're going to talk about the arrest class. Can you see this? It's kind of going on to the, I can move the screen for me. The last column is kind of getting blocked out there. Thank you. You good? Yeah. So you can see these A misdemeanors have a very high level of dismissal. You're really not getting that much as it goes down as you go up, but it also varies by race across categories. So if you look at A misdemeanors, it's around 50%. You get down to the A felonies, you don't have many non-Hispanic whites getting dismissed. 17%. 24% of Hispanic blacks, Hispanic whites, and Hispanic blacks. So right around a quarter of those. So that's a significantly higher number. And we also saw that with the E felonies. You didn't have as many whites getting arrest dismissed as you did the other racial categories. That's up to almost a third for the other racial categories. So dismissals are not even overall, as I showed on the last slide, but they're also not even across race by the category. So we wanted to explore this a little more, and I can't tell you how many models we've run trying to get our head around all these cases and what's the best way to look at them, think about them. So I'm just going to present some basic ones today. They say we're using this top charge, we're breaking it down by those arrest categories, race, ethnicity, and we want to see controlling for other things that we typically would control for. What might be creating this difference, or does it exist when you control for these other factors? So we have gender in there, sex, male, female. We have our racial categories you've seen, ethnicity. We've run it a couple different ways. The one I'm showing today just has no prior record or prior record. We've run it with prior convictions, prior felony convictions. They have prior adjudications in juvenile court. So we've run it different ways, but for today I'm showing the model that just does no prior record. And those are the categories that I went through. And we've run this two ways, county fixed effects. There's 62 counties in New York. And we've also run it just with New York versus the rest of the state. The next model has the county fixed effects. And I would not be a good academic if I did not at least put up one table. I probably have three that you can't read. So that's how you know you've been in your career too long, when your success is putting up an unreadable table. But our reference category here is white. And so what we're showing here in this, and what I wanted to point out, it is the patterns of dismissal as they compare to white. So is a non-Hispanic black more or less likely to have their case dismissed, controlling for these other factors? And we see kind of a pattern here where for the A and B misdemeanors, many of the minority categories are less likely to have their case dismissed. But when you get up into the more serious categories, into the felonies, they're more likely to have their case dismissed. So what might that say? Like, that's where, Teddy and I sit back and scratch our head. And, well, we know they have the stop and frisk policies in New York. We know that they have more police officers in certain neighborhoods where more minorities live. So this could be explained for arrests being made where the prosecutor doesn't really have enough evidence to move forward. I don't want to say bad arrest, but that's kind of the term we use when we chat about it. Just the prosecutor might not have anything to move forward with. This person was stopped because the police officer knows them, they've been in trouble before, etc. And you kind of see that pattern. I wish I had like a pointer, but it flips at the felony line for the non-Hispanic, blacks, and others. And then for the Hispanics, it doesn't flip till a little later in the felonies, but the pattern flips from less likely to get dismissed to more likely. The more serious you get, the more serious the offense, which is counterintuitive, right? You would think that the more serious offenses, you would see it less and less likely to get dismissed. And that's not the pattern we're seeing for these particular cases. So this is the only time I'm going to break it down to New York City for you today. New York City is the only jurisdiction in New York that talks about the difference of a case being dismissed pre-arraignment or post-arraignment. Pre-arraignment, from our interviews with people in New York, really means there's not any evidence to move forward. The district attorney's just not going to do anything. Post-arraignment means they lost a witness, there was some bad evidence, the judge isn't going to let some evidence in, other things happen that they dismiss it post-arraignment. We unfortunately don't have that information for the whole state, only for New York City. So with our idea of this, is it a bad arrest in the back of our head? We're like, well, if it's bad arrest, we should see more pre-arraignment dismissals in New York City for minority offenders. We see the same pattern we saw basically for the whole state. Less is significant. The only line that's significant the whole way across is our non-Hispanic blacks, but it's the same pattern where they less likely to get dismissed as misdemeanors, more likely for the higher levels. So this kind of tells us there might be something going on, especially with the black population and these more serious arrests, that they're having many more dismissed. Our other variables you can see here, I forgot to mention on the other slide, they kind of do what you think they would do. Males are much less likely to have their case dismissed. If you have a 0 prior record, you're much more likely to have your case dismissed. We need to put in an age quadratic term or do some more with age, but it's kind of has a little curvilinear pattern for us. So we're still exploring that. But right now we're not really talking. It's more of a control right now than a variable of interest. So it was interesting to us that we see the same pattern, but now it's only significant for the non-Hispanic blacks. Post-arraignment, again, similar pattern. And now you're significant for both the non-Hispanic blacks and the non-Hispanic other, which again is a very small sample. And our other variables still work in the same way. So thinking about this and how we're writing it up, or how we've written it up in this chapter, is it seems to be evidence that many more minorities are having an arrest and then having it dismissed. And we're relating it specifically to New York City and writing in about their stop and frisk policies. And then there's data that you can get on the number of arrests from those policies. So that's kind of how we're framing it in the chapter. But for us, I think the most important takeaway was, if we just start with conviction, which is what we would normally do if we were going to do a paper on plea bargaining, we would miss half of these arrests. We would miss all this movement that's going on the front end. So then after this, we move to the chapter on alternative dispositions and other things that go on. But for today, I'm just going to move right to plea bargaining to save time and to try to fit this into my 45-minute time frame here. So for those who are prosecuted, we now want to look at what is their outcome. And this is where we go back to the Woodridge article and the piece that tried to look at what was the size of the plea bargain. Did they get pled down? Were they convicted of the same offense they were arrested for? How do you look at that? We're going to control for mode of conviction, knowing it's similar to Pennsylvania. Again, 96% of the cases are plea bargains. So we're not losing much of the sample when we look at plea bargains. It's almost everybody. And we want to look at the size of the plea bargains and how they differ across race and ethnicity. So now this one you can read, it's big numbers. This is just a bivariate table. And we have 2 of these. I'll be going back and forth between the 2 of them to show you. So this is non-Hispanic white. So this is our white sample. And the yellow highlighted line down the middle is the percent that are found guilty through a plea of the same offense class that they were arrested for. Now, it could be a different offense. Say you were arrested for a sexual assault and you plead to an aggravated assault to avoid the sex offender registry. You're still in the same class, but it has some different connotations that we talk to in the book as well. But you see, for the unclassified misdemeanors, a lot of people stay at that. As I said, again, it's DUI, so there's not a lot, and there's a lot of mandatories. There's not a lot of room there. But as you go, you see less and less people are getting convicted at the same category as they were arrested. And I've added a new category here we didn't talk about before. This is infractions and violations. This is interesting because an infraction and violation doesn't show up in the arrest. It's a non-fingerprintable offense, so they're not recorded in the offense data. But if you get pled down to an infraction violation, your fingerprints are destroyed, your state ID is destroyed, you now have 0 prior record again. So there's a lot of good consequences if you plead down here, and it's usually a fine. So during this time, now marijuana is recreational in New York, but at this time, up to an ounce of marijuana was an infraction or violation after they got rid of the Rockefeller laws. It was a fine. But you wouldn't have a criminal record, you wouldn't get fingerprinted. So that's why this category didn't show up on arrest, but now we had to put it in because look how many people are getting pled down to this category. It's a very popular plea, especially if you have no prior record, because it keeps you with a no prior record. I was surprised anyone got that from here. I was like, how do you go from murder to infraction? So we haven't quite figured that out. That's a pretty big one, but you can see, so like for people with D felonies, a very popular plea is to an A misdemeanor. That's important for us because if you have a misdemeanor arrest, there's different collateral consequences than a felony arrest. You don't lose your right to carry firearms in New York. You don't lose some like the right to run for some public offices. You don't, a lot of job applications ask, college applications ask, have you ever been convicted of a felony? Right, so this margin here from E to F and DF down to a misdemeanor, it's a big deal for the individual. Same as getting the infraction or violation is a big deal. So you see, very popular category for the police to go down to. Now remember, this is white. Now we're going to go to our non-Hispanic blacks. Again, you see it starts up in the high 30s and goes down, but not nearly as far down as it did for the whites. But you see here, much larger pleas to infraction violation for A misdemeanors, for E felonies, and D felonies. I don't know if this is where I was going to flip back and forth. So you can see the 66, 40, 43. Let's see if I can go backwards here. Ashley. I'm used to doing this with the clicker, but you got that. I got it. Great. There we go. All right.
Some of it slides.
Okay. So you see for the whites here, this coming down from here, it wasn't nearly as large. The 60s about the same, but it was in the 20s here. And for the black males, these are both in the 40s, almost 50% get pled down to the lowest. So again, that might be indicating the prosecutor might have evidence, enough evidence to get you on something more minor, but they know they're not going to be able to prove that original charge the police officer gave you to. Charged you on. So that was kind of our takeaway there. And you also see what's interesting is some people, it goes up. Not a lot, but for some. And we were actually going to try to do these as some of these as count models, regression models. And we're like, what do we do for negatives? Because some of them actually would be a negative because it's an increase in the severity of the offense. So we're still playing around with that. They said we're having fun running lots of different models. Unfortunately, it take a while to run with the size of the data. So what we did now was we moved again to regressions. And what we did here is we did this two-way. We're patrolling for the same things, basically. And we used the arrest sample and the conviction sample. Normally, when you say what would it be, people for conviction, everyone only uses the conviction sample, but we know we lost a lot of information. So we want to do it both ways and see what did we miss. So what we're looking at here is a logistic regression on the odds. So we have the odds ratios here of being convicted of the same offense you were arrested on. Right? And you can see that we do have some significant, my tables, this is the one that like, it keeps messing up for me. So you kind of have to tilt your head to the right. These labels are supposed to be over that way. They looked right in Excel, and then I paste them in. And Ashley was trying to help me fix them. I don't quite get it. So we have some significant effects here, and there are patterns again that I wanted to point out. Of course, I never look at my notes, so let me catch up to where I am in my notes to make sure I didn't forget anything. Oh, I forgot to tell you the sample size. So when we go to the conviction sample, the next slide, it's going to go down to 654,000 from the 1.2 million. So makes sense based on how many dismissals. We said it was almost half. Okay. Talk about that. Here we go. So you see that you have, again, down in the lower levels, you have a higher odds of being convicted of the same offense. And then for Hispanics, you see Hispanic other races, it's much lower. So when you're controlling for some of the other factors, it flushes out a little bit differently. And we were trying to figure out how to make a graph of this. But for example, look at the Hispanic whites for an A felony. They're twice as likely to keep that A felony as a white, right? And for a non-Hispanic other race, the odds ratio is 1.4. So it's very high, 1.8 for Hispanic blacks on both B and A felonies as well. So almost twice as likely to keep that offense if you didn't get dismissed, right? We saw high dismissals, but then if you didn't get dismissed, the story starts to change. You're less likely to be moving down and getting a plea, and you're more likely to be staying at the higher charge. So again, that says like why the sampling might matter when you're looking at this. My mouse is not recognized. There we go. So this is the smaller conviction sample. Again, we have the same pattern, only all the results are just, they're slightly different. I made a note here on what I wanted to point out on this for you. Actually, I put it in the next slide. So they're slightly different. They're bigger at some points out here and smaller at some points. So when you go from the arrest to the conviction sample, the effects are almost always larger when you include arrest, particularly at the lower levels. They're bigger because there's more people, there's more action going on, because if it was dismissed, you obviously can't be convicted of the same offense you were arrested on. It's gone, right? So your effects get bigger. This only changes for the really high level offenses for the Black and Hispanic blacks, and there it increases in the conviction sample that I was showing you previously for the B, C, A felonies. It actually increases when you go to just the conviction sample. So it's a bit of a complicated picture that you don't get if you just start with conviction. And since we're doing the chapters on the dismissal and the alternative dispositions, it follows a nice story through to what's happening now at conviction and why might it be different, and why do we, if we just looked at conviction, would we draw a different conclusion than if we include the arrest sample? It's kind of like when you're doing, I have sentencing scholars in here, right? Jeff and Dr. Ballmer. If you're doing sentencing research, some people include all the zeros, right, in the incarceration sentence, and other people just do the people that got at least some incarceration, and it changes your outcome, it changes your picture. So that's kind of what we're showing here. Then, similar to the Woodridge article, we tried to do distance traveled. So if you were charged with an A felony, you can go down to an infraction violation. You've got 1 through 8, so you can go down 7 steps. If you were charged with a misdemeanor, you can only go down 2 steps. A misdemeanor, you can get a B or an unclassified. So it gets a little messy to look at, but that's how we coded it, numeric. So this is a simple OLS regression. So you can talk about these as, what's the best way to explain this? Compared to a white offender that was arrested for the same offense, did you get a plea bargain that was bigger, which would mean small number, or did you get one, or do you come in at a grade higher? So you can see here for Hispanic blacks, an A felony, they were arrested for an A felony. After a plea bargain, they're still at least one grade higher than a white that was arrested for the same offense. And the numbers are close to one for the B and C felonies, which is where we saw the action in the other tables as well. And again, for non-Hispanic blacks, it's not as high, but it's, odds ratio, it's getting close to you're getting a grade higher, almost a grade higher, especially for B felonies. So we think that's an important message. And this is going to be a great graph when we get it done. I was hoping to get it done for you today, but we're not quite there yet. But it's really interesting because it's still telling the same story, which is good in a way, it's bad in a way, but it's good in a way for us because every way we're cutting the data and looking at us, we're kind of getting the same story. Something's going on with dismissals. A lot more cases are getting dismissed for the minorities, but when they stay in, they're more likely to get convicted at the same grade, or if they're offered a plea, they're not getting the same size plea as a white defendant. Now, wouldn't you all love if I had the sentencing chapter done to do next? Not quite there yet. So I had a slide here that kind of basically just says what I said looking at the chart. So the non-Hispanic blacks consistently receive higher grade offenses upon conviction. The difference is highest at the B felony level, as it was in the other charts. For some Hispanics, blacks who are likely to receive a plea that is about one grade compared to their white counterparts for arrest in the C, B, and A felony range. So that's kind of our message that we keep finding over and over again. It's those two populations, and it's in the higher ranges where the disadvantage is coming in if they didn't get their case dismissed, which was about half of them. Okay. So what do we think of this? A lot. They said I put the term bad in quotes because I probably shouldn't use that word, but we haven't come up with a better one yet. There may be many arrests for which there's not really good evidence, especially based on the stop and frisk and aggressive policing policies that New York City had at the time. We find that if you just ignore dismissals and start with a smaller and smaller sample, you are missing a lot of the picture. And it is an interesting picture and story to tell. So we think it's important to not just start. So when we get to sentencing, we start with the whole sample. We don't start with just the people that were sentenced and then we run it, we go backwards. And so it's a different way of thinking about sentencing. We also find that much of the action in the plea bargaining and the dismissal is in that middle range of offenses around the A misdemeanor and the lower level felonies. We particularly find with the plea bargains, there's a lot of action going to the infraction violation, which maintains you with a 0 prior record. And then there's a lot of action going from E and D felonies down to misdemeanors that reduce the collateral consequences. One thing I do want to say here though, unless I have it on the next slide. I might have it on the next slide. Yeah, why is this important? Even though we say these arrests, a lot of them are getting dismissed, and we're talking about this is the hydraulic nature and maybe a correction for actions that the police perhaps shouldn't have taken, or they brought someone in that shouldn't have been in. That arrest can be traumatic for the individual. The police can use force, right? We just had over the weekend, the Miami Dolphins player, right, face down on the ground. Arrests can be forceful. People get shot during arrests. If you get arrested and you don't have bail, you have to sit in jail. You could lose your job. You're separated from your family until arraignment, and they decide what to do with your case. So just to say, oh, the system corrects for it, doesn't mean it wasn't a traumatic experience for the individual that went through it. So we don't want to just hop over it and say, oh, it's okay if the police make a bad arrest because the prosecutor is going to fix it. They're not going to take the case. Well, the person already went through that humility of the arrest and in any other collateral consequences with their job, their family, maybe it happened in front of their house, their neighbor saw it, all kinds of things that, that impact a person. So it can be a traumatic event in and of itself. So we don't want to gloss over that and just say, oh, look, the prosecutor corrects for it, even though we are finding it's a good thing, right? If there's not enough evidence, it's a good thing that these cases are getting dismissed, but it doesn't necessarily make up for the arrest. And again, as you move forward, if you miss a lot of this population, then when you just look at the back end, you might not find the disparities that actually exist because it's already been baked in the front end. And we find this a lot also with prior record. we're finding it's not enough just to control for prior record because it's so endogenous with race in our sample that you can't, controlling for it doesn't fix it. That's why I said we've been looking at prior record as none, as a prior conviction, prior felony conviction, prior arrest, and then we're trying to think of other ways to dice it out because it is so important for particularly the dismissals. It was one of the biggest factors in whether you got a dismissal or not, and also in the plea bargaining tables. I don't know if I pointed that out. I don't think I did in the plea bargaining. It's a huge factor. So if you're a minority, you're more likely to have a police contact. Now you have a record. The next, you're more likely to maybe be stopped by the police again. And that's how we think about cumulative disadvantage occurring. So the further downstream you get, the more action you're missing, the more the sample you're missing. And we're going to have really cool graphs in our sentencing chapter on that to show from the different samples exactly how it looks differently. So as I said earlier, we work backwards. We start with the biggest and then go smaller and smaller and show how it looks when you get there. Moving forward, we're hoping to inform the field about the general two-way, that this could be a two-way street, and to look between the points, to compare the models is what we're going to do in the next chapter. That's going to be our next big lift. The models such as Kurleychek, Dr. Kurleychek used, and Wildridge and Sutton, and also DePreet and Elric, they suggest models that are similar to interest models, how your interest compounds on your credit card. So we have a bunch of different models we're going to test, and then in each one, show with the different samples, show here's how much you missed. Here's this model says there's no disparity, but if you do it this way and use this model or this sample, it really pops out to you what's there. And that's what we're hoping will be the main takeaway from our book, is people that read it can look at what their data is, the question they're trying to answer, and then think about what modeling strategy might capture their question best, or maybe compare a couple. So we're seeing that as our big contribution at the end. We think each chapter is independently interesting, but the end, that's the big contribution we're hoping to make to the field in 2025. We are scheduled for publication with Temple University Press. So I hope that you will all give it a read when it comes out next year. And I thank you for your time today. I'm ready for questions.
So we'll take questions in the room first, and people online can put those in the chat.
Yes.
I was keeping a close eye, especially on the coefficients for Hispanics, given the time period of the study, which I think you said was 2010 to 2013.
The cohorts, yes.
Okay, so I'm curious, how do you thought about accounting for immigration policies, or especially like arrest rates by race, because that was the time in the US where we had the highest rate of immigration enforcement, and it had trickled down to local law enforcement. So I'm wondering if, like, especially given some of the effects across the different models, if you thought about that informing part of your findings.
Actually, we hadn't included that. New York City's historically sanctuary city. I'm not sure what those policies are, but it is something that would be interesting to look into, what they were at that time. I'm not sure how. We don't have that status in our data, and a lot of illegal immigrants, if they do come in the system, then they go through into the federal system based on their status. So that's something we'd have to think a lot about, how to work that in there. But that's a very interesting point. Yes.
How does the DCJS data capture ACDs? Do those just show up as regular post-arraignment dismissals, or is there sort of a separate outcome when they adjourn to later dismiss?
They have them in there. It's called an alternative disposition in the data. So it's an actual category in there. And that happens after arraignment. So they wouldn't show up as a pre-arraignment dismissal or even as a dismissal. They'd show up as their own category, because it's I'm trying to think the term they use in New York, but it's something in
Adjournment to
contemplation of dismissal, right? So if you don't get in any more trouble in 6 months or a year, it's dismissed. So it's still going to be in there as their outcome in their first arrest that we have in here. So it's a separate outcome.
Were there any differences across race in terms of who was getting those from various charges?
There were some, they weren't as big as in the dismissals, and it was more, those happen a lot in traffic offenses. So it was more in different categories. So, yeah, but it was similar, but not as large.
Thanks. It looked, as you mentioned, prior record is really important, particularly for dismissals and particularly for misdemeanors dismissals. Can you think of that as a mediator of the race main effect and see if you take that out, what happens to the main effect of non-Hispanic Black on dismissal? So in other words, if you remove prior record, does the main effect of non-Hispanic Black become positive and significant?
We do sensitivity analysis where we do this only with people with no prior record and then people with prior record. And it does make a difference. I don't have those tables on here today for you, but I can get them to you.
That contributes to your argument, right? And
Yeah.
basically saying it's working through prior
Yes.
contact with the police.
Yeah.
And that's explaining the disadvantage.
It's true of sentencing too.
Yeah.
That's right.
And that's why we said it's just so endogenous that you can't, like, just controlling for it doesn't quite account. So we did some sensitivity analysis, splitting the sample up different.
I mean, it's
different
hard
ways
to
of
say
looking
if
at
it's just police activity, because it could be all kinds of things that explain
Yeah.
prior record, but it fits with your argument.
Thank you. Yes, Joe.
It's a great word, really, so hats off. Because I didn't realize you have a whole thing going on. This is really cool. My question is more speculative, or I don't know, allowing you to speculate. I'm curious what you think particularly the rates of dismissals would look like, maybe even in like the early 2000s or late 90s, right, when incarceration peaked. Right, because in this period, I mean, incarceration rates are still, historically pretty high, but
Mhm.
During this time period, they were beginning to decline a little bit. And I'm curious if you think these trends would have held at the height of when incarceration was kind of peaking and still kind of accelerating.
I think the trend would hold, but that it wouldn't be as large a number. And I particularly think early 2000s, when the country was on high alert after 9/11. In the early 2000s, you would have seen much less dismissal. Particularly for certain types of offenses, but we don't have that data for me to confirm that, but that my gut feeling would be that the racial trends would probably be the same. But you would have much less dismissals overall during that get tough kind of crazy era. And I wonder if age would have been different then too, because we had the whole super predator, young offender kind of craze going on. So age might have been more important at that time as well.
Does the data go back to 2000, or am I misremembering? Or 2010?
We started in 2010 because of the change in the Rockefeller laws, and also, well, they have data before 2000, but in 2000 or 2001, they changed their whole data coding scheme. Everything changed, so you can't, without a whole lot of work, try to compare those data sets. And again, you had right around 2001, everything changed with 9/11, and then the Rockefeller laws were changing 2006 to 2009, kind of that time period. So that's why we picked this cohort. And we didn't use the whole 9 years, 10 years that we have, because we were doing some other work on this with recidivism. So we wanted to have some time to look at 3 and 5 year recidivism in our sample.
The reason I asked is because the dismissal rates seem really high, which you mentioned was very surprising.
Yeah.
And yet we still have incarceration rates that are very high. So it's a little mind-boggling to think about.
Well, you have, the New York Police Department too, though. It's what, 35,000 officers just for the city, New York City? And they added most of those officers during that time period. So you're just having a lot more people come in contact with the police. So I think the dismissal rates are also part of that. If you look before stop and frisk, I bet you had less dismissals. I bet then it would really go down.
Elaborate on why you chose just the first arrest, and maybe that's what I think I heard you say. and whether that yields a sample that's omitting, people with many arrests. And I wonder, one way to think about it is like, would the dismissal rate be the same if you use all arrests? Like, why not? use all
Okay,
arrests?
so it's the first arrest during our time period. They could already have a prior
Yeah, I
record.
have a prior record, but still, I
Right.
wonder if decision makers are considering this person and what to do with them, and your sample is all people with just one arrest in the data, but some of them may have like 8 other cases, 8 other arrests, and I wonder.
That are open at the same time.
Yeah,
I
and I
mean.
don't know if a prosecutor or any other person in the system might consider that. But I just wonder if you would find the same dismissal rate if you had just all arrests, like it'd be a real simple thing to see.
Yeah, we could definitely do that. As I said, we did this because we're doing some work with the recidivism. So anything that happened after that first time they came in our sample, we counted as recidivism for this study. But we definitely could go back and look at it that way. It's in there.
I think the reason you might want to do that is because there's probably racial and ethnic differences in the number of
Number of-
arrests, in this period. And so whether or not it matters for decision making is unclear, but I think it would be a good sensitivity check.
Yeah. And it's kind of like when we look at the sentencing data, we look at the most serious offense per judicial transaction, but we have in there, how many offenses there were or how many they were charged with, and you can control for were there multiple offenses. In this data, we also can control for if they were already on probation. We have a variable in there that notes if they're on probation, which alters findings as well. Yes.
Just kind of going off of that, I forgot that y'all were looking at like the most serious offense. Have you thought about looking at like how many offenses people have at different levels or a different level of offense to see what the effects are? Because I mean, like we all know that people can be charged with things that is like, if you're in a court of law, it's like never gonna be proven. It's just kind of like throwing things on the board.
Yeah, so we did look at that a little bit, but the size of the population we have to include all the offenses really makes it unmanageable. So if we do that, it's going to be more like the approach that I just mentioned, where we say, okay, we're looking at the most serious. They had 3 other charges, or they had 2 other charges, versus looking at every charge they have. Does that make? It gets unyielding very quickly.
Yeah, I guess piggybacking off that, I'm wondering if you think that perhaps the dismissal rate is so high because of nuisance arrests, kind of. So arresting people who maybe are experiencing homelessness or mental health crises or things like that, just to kind of, because they're annoying people on the street, you know what I mean?
But that doesn't really account for the high dismissal rates at the upper level felonies
Right.
that we're finding, especially for the minority offenders. That would be more the minor, like disorderly conduct, public drunkenness, disturbing the peace. Those would be the lower level ones,
Right.
and we're still seeing it, the high rate really at the,
Yeah, no, I'm just
The
wondering if
high-level
you think it
offenses.
impacts anything that you found at all. I'm sure it wouldn't explain everything, but just thinking about it.
I don't know if someone
Yeah.
was homeless at the time of the arrest.
Yeah.
These are like great sociological questions that you can't answer with administrative
Data you have.
data, unfortunately. So like Dr. Ballmer's question, we can go back and address that numbers are in there. We can do that. We can think about it. And we could
Right.
maybe look at trends in homelessness in New York City. But we don't have like those variables in the data to know that this person that was arrested was homeless.
Mhm.
Right? So,
The
or had
data
mental
is-
health issues.
Right,
That's stuff
Okay.
that,
makes sense.
that's more of an ethnographic, smaller sample interview
Yeah.
study. Pam, did you have a question? Well, I thought I saw your hand go up. Anything online?
No.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming. I appreciate it.